Hi scholars. In this video, we're going to be talking about Mark Knapp's stages of coming together and coming apart. This model is oftentimes used to help analyze a relationship, to better understand it. But in addition to helping us with that, this model will help us recognize the extreme importance of communication in helping a couple come together, or the lack of communication and how it causes a couple to come apart. Now, this is based on something called stage theory. Stage theory is a very popular approach throughout academia. If you think back to some of the classes you've taken, when they're analyzing a phenomenon or helping us understand a process, they will oftentimes break it down into very predictable stages. This helps us be able to look at what is happening, see the stage that it's in, and have a better understanding of how did it get to this stage, and how can it either go to the next stage or not. A common one is in high school biology, you were probably taught mitosis. Mitosis uses stage theory to explain the process of cellular regeneration, and it broke it down into several predictable stages. Well, Mark Knapp attempts to take that approach and look at relationships. So through this, we're going to be talking about the 5 stages of coming together, and then we'll talk about the 5 stages of coming apart. As we look at these stages, I want you to be focused on what role is communication playing? How is it that communication is leading to the stages of coming together? And then when we're talking about stages of coming apart, how it drives the relationship through those stages. So we're going to start with the stages of coming together. In the first stage of coming together, called initiation, here the two recognize each other as individuals. They recognize each other as individuals. So for example, if you're in a class, you and everybody else in there are part of a group, the class. That first day, you know that you recognize yourself as an individual, but at first everybody else is just simply classmates. And then you notice one person in particular. Okay, that's recognizing them as an individual. Or at a bar, there's all these people at the bar. Initiation is when you recognize one. And initiation oftentimes is, perhaps an introduction, extended eye contact. This lasts for seconds. In that moment, that relatively brief amount of time, we gather just very quick information and determine, is there a potential for relationship here? If the answer to that is no, we move on. If the answer to that is yes, then we go on to the second stage. And the second stage is experimenting. Now, with initiation, I want to emphasize that this is a very brief amount of time. Sometimes when people do relationship analysis papers, they'll include initiation, and we spent 3 weeks talking on the phone every single day for 5 hours. Well, how many conversations did it take before you realized you were talking to an individual? And do you think they didn't recognize that you were an individual, not simply a member of a group? So initiation is important to realize this is a very, very brief amount of time. Traditionally, initiation was based almost exclusively on things like appearance or reputation. Now, because of online communities, people oftentimes go through this stage based on interests, values. We form social groups online, and that ends up being what forms this initiation stage. So experimenting. We go into experimenting. Here we begin to exchange little bits of information about ourselves with each other. This is when we're talking about, so do you like baseball? And, I love baseball. Oh gosh, who's your favorite team? And they start talking about that. During this stage, we really focus only on the things we have in common. Because during this stage, what we're really doing is we're exchanging information and trying to determine, do we have enough in common to continue? So if one of them says, hey, do you like baseball? And the other goes, no, I really don't like baseball. The first one doesn't keep talking about baseball. They go, okay, and change the subject. Also, if we start talking and we find something that we really disagree on, we tend not to talk that much about it in this case. And if we do continue talking about it, in all likelihood, this is going nowhere. But I'm just going to express my views anyway. So during the experimenting stage, we are limited in what we can self-disclose. So if we're in a group together, you can only disclose the information that you trust to the least trustworthy person there. Because when you self-disclose it to the individual you're talking to in the group, everybody in the group hears it. So how much you can self-disclose in this stage and how much they can self-disclose in this stage is really very limited. But if there seems to be enough in common, then we go to the third stage, which is intensifying. This is where we arrange to have more one-on-one interaction. Now, intensifying, this could be we exchange phone numbers and talk on the phone. Maybe, hey, listen, I got tickets to the game. Why don't just you and I go? Okay, so we're arranging for an opportunity for us to get to know each other without the person in the group that you wouldn't want to trust with the information you want to self-disclose. Intensifying also oftentimes includes the period of dating. This is where you two are spending a lot of one-on-one time together, and there's no real obligation, there's no assumptions to speak of here. It's just simply getting to know one another. During this period, as you self-disclose and they self-disclose, you exchange information and it helps both of you kind of get an idea, is there enough interest here for us to actually form a relationship? And if the answer to that is yes, then we can enter the fourth stage, integrating. This is when the two begin to integrate their lives together. So, for example, they will oftentimes change the pronouns they use to describe each other. Instead of it him and her, it's us, we. They might actually sometimes participate in a joint purchase, and it's ours. During this stage, they also begin to have what is called assumed plans. What that means is during the intensify stage, if the two don't make plans, it's assumed they don't have plans. During the integrating stage, here the two begin to have it to where if they don't not have plans, they have plans. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a friend who is in the integrating stage with somebody else, and you got tickets to the Ducks game. So you go, hey, I got tickets to the Ducks game. You want to go? And your friend goes, oh gosh, I would love to, but I got to check with Stephanie first. You're like, what do you mean you got to check with Stephanie? You need her permission? And he goes, no, I don't need her permission. It's just I got to make sure we don't have plans on Saturday. And you're like, well, what do you mean? I mean, do you guys have plans? Have you guys talked about Saturday? And he goes, no, we haven't talked about it. Okay, then you don't have plans. Now, here's the thing about assumed plans. If your friend goes to the Ducks game, or says, sure, okay, I'll go ahead and go, and then he's talking to Stephanie, and Stephanie says, hey, listen, on Saturday, I was thinking we could whatever, and your friend goes, oh, sorry, I would love to, but I'm going to the Ducks game. To Stephanie, it's not that he's choosing not to make plans because they have assumed plans. He's choosing to break those plans. And so you can understand how if one is an intensify, thinking we don't have assumed plans unless we talked about it, and the other is an integrate, where they believe there's assumed plans, we always hang out on Saturday, you can understand how there could be some misunderstanding there. Also during integrating, other people begin to see the two as a couple. And we'll just continue. We'll use Mike and Stephanie. Sorry, he's using the Stephanie name earlier. So if Mike is there but Stephanie isn't, people will oftentimes ask Mike, so how's Stephanie doing? Assuming that Mike would know. During the integrate stage, they oftentimes begin to assume certain liberties. For example, sometimes they will borrow something from the other and not really think they need to ask permission. Or they'll start to leave things over at the other's place. And this is referred to relationally as planting the flag. That in essence, they claim almost a part ownership of, say, a dresser drawer or whatever. Integrating, sometimes the two begin to spend so much time together, they start to say, it really doesn't make sense for us to pay rent on both places. Since we spend so much time at one of them, why don't we go ahead and give up the other apartment and just move in together? So during integrating, if the two of them as a couple begin to realize more and more through self-disclosure that there is potential for a permanent relationship, they move in, and not always, but sometimes they move in together. And once again, now you begin to see the person, not just they can really put their best face forward in a date, but you begin to see what it would be like to live with this person. What is this person really like? So now we're communicating more and more. We're self-disclosing more and more, not only through our words, but through our behaviors, through our actions. In essence, we're almost doing a trial run to a full partnership. And if there is enough here, then they move into the fifth stage, which is bonding. And bonding is when we publicly assume full responsibility for one another. Oftentimes, bonding involves a ceremony where we invite friends and family and people we care about. They oftentimes make pledges to each other. Traditionally, bonding was marriage. For a variety of reasons, bonding is much more broadly defined now. My generation, Gen X, we were referred to, some of you may have heard this term, the latchkey kids. And the latchkey kids, that concept came about because our parents divorced a lot. And so one parent would be gone and the other parent would be working when we got home from school. And so we had to let ourselves in and basically watch ourselves until 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. And again, it's called the latchkey kids because there used to be these latches that some kids would have where the house key would be latched to them. Well, our generation grew up and we're really determined not to do that to our kids. And so the Gen X generation, it took a long time for them to get married. And so the divorce rate for Gen X was really low. And the millennials, the generation that came after, they had not only the example of their parents, but also for various political and social reasons, many of them began to question the value of the traditional marriage. Some people even saying that marriage is just a piece of paper. And if somebody believes that marriage is just a piece of paper, they probably shouldn't get married. But so they form every bit as strong of a personal bond together. They are life partners without necessarily a formal marriage. And so all of that would be included here. So while some books still refer to the bonding stage as marriage, it doesn't have to actually be marriage. Think of it as a life partnership, a total commitment to one another. So when you look through these stages of coming together, I want you to notice how each of them involved deeper and deeper communication. That at first, it's very superficial. If it's a social initiation or a social media initiation or message forms or whatever, your initial impression of this person is what you read in their posts. If it's in person, it might be their physical appearance. It might be clothes that they're wearing. If they're wearing an Atlanta Braves baseball cap, you might think, hey, they like the Atlanta Braves, and I do. Or we're both interested in baseball. So you look for things that kind of indicate that there's a commonality. Then it goes to experimenting. Here we're beginning to reveal more information about ourselves, looking to see, do we have things in common? If yes, we go to intensify where we can dramatically increase the self-disclosure. Sometimes people making a first phone conversation after just meeting the last day or two, and they can talk for 5 or 6 hours. And so they're sharing a lot more about themselves. If that proves that there's enough here, then they go to integrating, and here we begin to really kind of open up our lives, and we integrate the lives together. And if that's indicating that we make a good couple, a good partnership, then we can enter the fifth stage. So what drives relationships between these stages is increasing self-disclosure and deeper listening. So you look at self-disclosure and Powell. Deeper listening, deeper self-disclosure, and it brings a couple closer and closer together. So the next thing I want to talk to you about are the stages of coming apart. Similar to how stages of coming together was driven by increased communication, here you're going to see how decreased communication actually causes the two to come apart. So in the first stage, we have differentiation. In many ways, differentiation is the opposite of experimenting when we're coming together. In experimenting, you'll remember that we're looking only for the things we have in common. We tend to kind of ignore topics that we don't have in common. But with differentiation, now we're really focused on those differences. And sometimes this is referred to as a buyer's regret, that we move into a next stage and oftentimes we'll hop over to differentiation. It's better to be seen as that these are effectively applying brakes. It's to avoid going too fast. So when you go back to the stages of coming together briefly, when we go from experimenting to intensify, like, okay, we seem to have some things in common, so we arrange to, say, talk on the phone. And while you're visiting with the person, and all of a sudden they're like expressing some of their political views, or maybe they like a team you hate, or whatever, or maybe there's just something about them or their general attitude, those differences really can become stark. That's entering differentiation. And what you do here is you're starting to focus on the differences also, and you start to think, is it worth it to continue this? Are these differences too much? If the answer to that is no, then you continue with intensify, and the stages of coming together continue. So if we didn't have differentiation, we would only focus on the things we have in common that we enjoy talking about, and we would zip through the stages coming together. So differentiation, even though it's part of the stages of coming apart, is a very, very healthy step for a relationship to go through. Coming back to the slide for stages of coming apart. Oftentimes your partner might enter the stage of differentiation and you're not aware of it. In other words, they might not be talking about the differences as much as they're thinking about them. But sometimes they do communicate about them. And when they communicate about a difference, sometimes we'll be able to talk it out, and maybe there's a misunderstanding or whatever. Sometimes, though, it can turn into an argument, and the argument can become very intense. So let's say, for example, we're coming together and we're focused on the fact that we like comedies, and we like baseball, and we like country music and such. And then as we start talking, we realize that one is a conservative Republican and the other is a liberal Democrat. And they're both rather extreme and intransigent in their views. One is pretty far right, one is pretty far left. So they start arguing about that. And they notice that the arguing is getting more and more intense, and it takes up more and more of their time because they're both passionate about it. And then finally one of them says, wait a minute, look, I'm not going to convince you, and you're not going to convince me. Why don't we just not talk about politics? And every election, we'll just fill out our ballots and cancel each other's vote. The other one agrees, and it's like, phew, the arguing is done, and you've entered the second stage of coming apart, circumscribing. Circumscribing is when we officially or unofficially rule certain topics off limits. Now, what do I mean by officially or unofficially? Officially happens when we actually say, look, let's just agree to disagree and not talk about this anymore. The unofficially happens inside our own mind. We might feel something, but we know that if we bring it up, it's going to cause a fight. So we choose not to bring it up. Okay, both of those are circumscribing. We're limiting communication about that topic. And at first it works great. In fact, it works too well. We're not arguing about politics anymore, and all of a sudden, whew, we're back to talking about baseball and country music and comedies and things that are fun. Until one of us might be, say, a very devout believer in God, and the other one a very devout atheist. And now we're fighting about that. Well, generally, it doesn't take very long for us to solve this one, because the arguments about politics we solve very quickly by agreeing to disagree and just not talking about it. So we go, look, let's just not talk about it. Let's just agree to disagree. We'll respect each other's opinion, which is important, and we'll just not communicate anymore about it. And everything's back to good. We're talking about baseball and comedies and country music until. Every time each of us come home from work, we bring with us all the stress and strain of work, and we come home and we complain about our boss, we complain about customers or clients, we complain about coworkers, whatever. And we just do a stress dump. We vent. And all that stress is now being piled onto the other person who wants to solve the problem but can't. And they're doing it back to you. And we're like, look, we just bring a lot of anguish from work. Let's just leave work at work. When we get home, let's just forget about work and focus on home stuff. And we're back to talking about baseball and country music and such until one might be close to their family, the other one not. And the one that is close to their family is constantly talking about what's going on with their parents, what's going on with their brother, their sister, and all of this. And they constantly want to spend time with them. They constantly want to bring them over. They want to spend holidays with them. And the other one, who may not have a background of being close to family, may not feel entirely comfortable with that. And they're like, look, I know you love your sister, and I'm glad for that. And I know you love your brother, and I'm glad for that. But I don't want to hear about them all the time. You talk about them sometimes, but my gosh, it's so constant. Can't we just try to reduce how much focus there is on them? It's worked with politics, it's worked with religion, it's worked with the stress from work. We're back to talking about baseball and country music. I think you get the idea. Here's the problem with circumscribing. Circumscribing, the problem is not that it doesn't work, it's that it works too well. And all of a sudden, one topic gets ruled out, and then another one, and another one. And suddenly the goal of communicating is really, let's avoid arguing, let's avoid fighting, let's avoid discussing these hard topics. Here's the thing, the topics that get ruled out will all have one thing in common. They will be the topics that both care the most about. If neither of them care about this topic, they wouldn't fight about it, and therefore it wouldn't be ruled out. If one is passionate about it, but the other one doesn't care, like let's say one is really passionate about politics and the other one doesn't really care about politics. I mean, yeah, sure, they vote as part of their civic responsibility, but they really couldn't tell you entirely what they're voting on. In that case, they don't really fight. The person who's passionate about politics explains, this is why we need to vote this way, and the other one's like, yeah, fine, sure, okay, that makes sense. They don't argue about it. So it's the things that both care passionately about. And what this does is it causes, once you close these out, the couple can't actually really grow together very much. They can't grow closer because, again, the stages coming together is about deeper and deeper communication. Here we're closing off communication about the most important topics to us. And that's when we lead to stagnation. The stage of stagnation is now that we've effectively cut off communication on these important topics, the relationship neither grows nor declines. It just simply stays there. It's in a constant state. We don't really get a lot of cognitive stimulation from our interactions with each other because we're not really allowed to talk very much about the things we care most about. Sometimes people stay in this stage for years, maybe even decades. They stay in this stage because really they're only staying together because it's easier to stay together than to break up. So they just exist. And oftentimes they rationalize, well, the reason we don't talk as much as we used to is because we kind of know each other now. I mean, before, when we were getting to know each other, there was a lot to talk about, but now we know each other. This is called the fallacy of history. It's a belief that you are now what you always will be. Take a moment. Think about the person you were 10 years ago. So if you're, say, 20 right now, think of your 10-year-old self. If you're 22, think of your 12-year-old self. If you're 18, think of your 8-year-old self. Have you changed? Are you really the same person you were 10 years ago? No. And the fallacy of history is we can look in the past and say, oh yes, I've changed, I've grown from the past, but now I'm my finished self. No, you're not. See, 5 or 10 years from now, you're going to be a very different person than you are now. So we don't get to know somebody once and for all. It's an ongoing process. But stagnating means that we kind of stop. During the stagnation, because we're not communicating and we're not really growing, there's not a lot of cognitive stimulation from our interactions. And the human mind naturally is drawn to what gives us energy, what gives us stimulation, and we tend to shy away from things that doesn't. This is why when you're learning a new subject that's really interesting, you oftentimes want to learn more. You really want to pay attention to it because your mind is enjoying that cognitive stimulation. When you first meet somebody, you're getting to know them, and these new experiences, and so your mind is naturally drawn to that cognitive stimulation. But during the stagnation stage, that's not happening. So all of a sudden, you're just kind of there. And then what oftentimes happens is that one of them finds something else. It could be that they find stimulation from, say, a video game or a new hobby, new friends, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, they want to spend as much time as they can doing that. So they're drawn to what gives them energy, that stimulates them cognitively, and kind of any moment spent in a relationship that is in stagnation is a moment not spent doing these things. So a common one over the last decade or so has been, just using one example, online video games. So people really get into online video games and they got relationships with other players and they've got like, oh, we do raids at 5 p.m. on Mondays or whatever, and they start to make plans to meet up with their online friends. And those plans become more important than the plans they have with their real life family, their real life partner. So this is when they enter the stage of avoiding. During the stage of avoidance, one partner begins to try to reduce the amount of time they spend interacting with the other partner. So we literally try to avoid. This can be done by, listen, yes, we can do that. We're going to be getting together with your parents at 2 o'clock, but I really need to be home by 5. It's really important that I'm home by 5. No, sorry, I can't help you with that because I got something going on at 6. Okay. So they got these other plans. When you're in a stage of avoidance, if your partner comes and says, hey, listen, I got an opportunity to go to something. It's for the whole weekend. Do you mind if I go? And you're like, yeah, sure. You look forward to your partner going away for the weekend. You look forward to the opportunity to kind of have your own time, your own space. Okay, so you're in the stage of avoidance. They're in the stage of stagnating. Sometimes after somebody's been in avoidance for a while and they now realize that whatever it is that is their replacement, again, it could be a group of friends, it could be one friend in particular, it could be video game, whatever it is, they now realize that this replacement, they choose this. This is what they would choose over the relationship with the other person. And now sometimes they'll begin to say things like, I just wish he would get the hint. I just want him to break up with me. I want him to find somebody. This is the person in avoidance hoping that the other person will take responsibility for terminating the relationship. They're hoping that the other person will effectively give them a guilt-free release. If he just finds somebody else, I don't have to feel bad. If he breaks up with me or she breaks up with me, I don't have to feel bad about it. And oftentimes they get what they want, what they wish for. The person in stagnation, at first they probably don't even notice they're being avoided because again, the relationship doesn't have a lot of interaction anyway. But once they realize it, they will oftentimes become frustrated, and it is the stagnating partner that goes to the 5th stage, terminating. And that is when the two cease any responsibility for one another. The opposite of bonding. Okay. So again, so oftentimes when they're both in stagnating, only one of them goes to avoiding. And oftentimes it is the person that didn't go to avoiding that goes to terminating. Not always, but oftentimes that's the case. So again, with the stages coming together, notice that it was increasing communication. With here, we notice a difference. We start arguing about it, and then we start to shut off communication on various topics. Again, topics that are important to us, and that's what drives the move towards terminating. Now, I want to take a moment and point out, sometimes people say, could you skip steps? Sure. Although it would be very difficult not to start with initiation. I don't know how you build a relationship with somebody that you don't know as an individual. So there's certainly generally this would be progression, but it could be that somebody is in bonding, they do differentiation, and all of a sudden, bam, they go to terminating. Like you find out something about another person that you did not know, and the difference is so great, it goes straight to terminating. It skips steps 2, 3, 4. That could certainly happen. It can also be that you go all the way down to terminating and then go back to coming together. My cousin, we used to think of him as my uncle because he's, from the earlier generation. He's a Gen X, or excuse me, baby boomer. I'm Gen X. But he and his wife Nancy, they went through the stages coming together. They had 3 kids. They were so close. We just thought they were like a model couple. Then all of a sudden they got divorced. And I still don't actually know the full story of it, and I wouldn't bore you with the details anyway, but they got divorced. And 9 years later of them being divorced, not really talking, they got back in touch with each other. And so they had gone all the way through these stages of coming apart. 9 years later, they start talking to each other again, and they begin again. They start dating, and they go through these relationships, and now they're happily married. And they're on like Facebook and such, and they post these, Dawn would post a picture of Nancy that says, as beautiful as the day that I met her, and so on. And they're like teenagers in love. And so you definitely can. Now, if you're in the stages of coming apart and you want to know how can I save the relationship, recognize coming together is just increasing communication. So if you're going through stages of coming apart, like maybe you're in a stagnating relationship, but you don't want to let go of it, then consider increasing this. Go back to the stages of coming together. Start getting to know each other again. Spending time where you're able to sit down and just talk. In any well, I shouldn't say any relationship. Most relationships can be saved. Okay, so I apologize. This was a much longer video than I intended. But thank you very much for giving me your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.